Certainly all of us here tonight could tell a story or two of how something in our life was lost and we were able to find it. As you recall some of those experiences, some of those stories, some of those things that you have lost in your own life, recall, after having found it, the great joy that was yours. There is indeed great joy when we're finally able to find something that we lost. Especially when we lose something that is called relationships. Oh, the joy that is ours. The joy that is ours once we find that lost relationship that we were convinced would never be again. And we find it renewed. And all of a sudden we hear the sound. We hear the sound of music and dancing. Recently, a young lady shared with me a part of her story. She talked about how, as a young girl, she was always frustrated with her dad. She frustrated with that relationship because, of course, it seemed as the oldest daughter, at least in her mind, she could do nothing right. Everything she tried to do, it seemed that her dad would always be there to criticize or to correct what it was that she had attempted to do. She found herself becoming more and more estranged to her dad, and she couldn't wait. She couldn't wait until the day that she could finally leave that house that absolutely suffocated her. And so that day came, and she couldn't wait. She walked out the door, and she finally was able to have her own apartment. Freedom at last from the suffocation that she was experiencing in this place that was called home. And so she would live her adult life. She was always willing to come home and to be able to be with the family, to celebrate various events, holidays, birthdays, whatever it might be. But she always kept a polite distance from her dad. On one occasion, she talked about how she had returned home. The occasion was her mother's birthday. And so she returned home and she went into the house, and there as well was her sister and her sister's husband and their 4-year-old son. And their 4-year-old son had just been given a dog, a little puppy that he brought with as well. And so this young lady talked about how the fact that she entered the house, and of course, as soon as she entered the house, she still had that feeling that somehow the walls were closing in on her, and she kept that polite distance from her dad. And of course, as she felt those walls closing in on her, she decided to take her nephew and the new little puppy outside. They went into the backyard, and she took the leash off the puppy, and the puppy began to run around and was experiencing the joy of its own freedom, when all of a sudden Mom came out the back door and hollered at her and the nephew to say to them that dinner was ready, that they should come in, they should bring the dog with. So they tried to catch the dog. It was impossible, because as they would run towards the dog would continue to run. And all of a sudden, this young lady's dad came outside, and he told his daughter and the nephew, his grandson, to simply sit still. Don't go running after the dog, just sit down. And of course, Dad sat down as well, and of course, eventually the puppy realized the game was over. And so the puppy walked right up to the dad, who had taken the leash from his daughter, and he had placed the leash on the dog, and into the house they went. Why, this infuriated this young lady even more. She couldn't even do that right. At least she thought that to be the case in her dad's mind. So they went into the house, they had the dinner, and before the birthday cake, she again felt the need to be able to go out, her and her nephew, and the puppy went out, this time out the front door, and they went out into the front yard, and this time the nephew, because of course he had seen his aunt do it, he took the leash off the dog. And the dog, the little puppy, just kept running around, now this time the front yard. Running and running and running, and of course, why, they decided it was time to go back in to have the birthday cake, but of course, every time they tried to grab the dog would run away. Till finally, the young lady said to her nephew, "Let us just sit down here on the curb. Eventually, the dog will come to us." And so, of course, they sat, and the dog was convinced the game was over. And so, sure enough, the dog started coming towards the young lady and the little boy. And as soon as it was almost close enough, the little boy jumped up to try to grab the dog. And, of course, the dog was convinced the game was on. And he started to run again, and this time the aunt scolded her nephew and told him, "Just sit still." To which they did, and all of a sudden the puppy returned. And the daughter took the leash and she put it back on the dog. And she turned around only to see that there her dad was standing, looking out the window. And her dad smiled at her, gave her the thumbs up, and laughed. And she, the young lady, why, she laughed in return. There was something about that meeting, having felt lost all those years, that all of a sudden, in this meeting through the window, why, there was a sound of music and dancing. It's true, isn't it? For you and I, as followers of Christ, gosh, we know how much we hate sin, and yet we find ourselves right in the midst of it. We find ourselves running away from God, running away from other relationships, because, of course, something tells us if we do that, why, then we'll experience real freedom. We will be left off the leash so that we can go and where we want to go and do what we want to do. We are convinced that somehow, even though we know how much we dislike sin, that somehow there might be the path to freedom. And yet there along all the way, we are reminded in today's gospel that we have a God of joy. We have a God who sweeps. We have a God who searches. We have a God who waits. And when he sees you and I finally coming to our senses, realizing that this game that we try to play, where we are convinced if we run here, if we run there, why, there will be happiness, and if we run over here, well, then there we'll find fulfillment, and we realize the happiness isn't there and the fulfillment is not lasting. And so, of course, finally we realize that maybe the game should be over, like the young son who came to his senses in the gospel today. And so, like the young son, we come back. And we have a God who is merciful. We have a God who has been patiently waiting. We have a God who's been convinced that even though we have lost our way, that we shall be found. We have a God that doesn't give up the search. We have a God that doesn't give up sweeping for the lost coin. We have a God who is constantly there, waiting on the curb, waiting in the backyard, waiting on the bench, waiting for you and I, in spite of our sinfulness, to come home. And there from a distance, through the window, we see a God who smiles at us and laughs and gives us the thumbs up. And hopefully, as we come to this table today, as we encounter this God of joy, this God of mercy, this God of forgiveness, hopefully we too can hear, that we can hear the music and dancing.